I love old books. Honestly, some people might say it's a little bit of an obsession of mine. My home is filled with bookshelves, loaded down heavy with books. All the walls are lined with the shelves, and most of the rooms have shelves freestanding in the middle of the floor. I'm probably only like 2 degrees from sleeping on a pile of books like some sort of literary dragon. I probably come off as some sort of indiscriminate hoarder with a dusty, messy, unmaintained house filled with trashy books. I couldn't be further from the truth. I know my stuff and the value of these books, and not some sort of fable about the sentimental value of books or knowledge. Like real market value, separate insurance policy for the books to kind of value. I also deal in rare and valuable books for my living. Suppose I could have led with that, dispel the hoarder imagery right off the bat, but then again, that's not really how I think of it. Think of myself as a collector first, a professional second. That's one of the good things about books, I suppose. There isn't the same sort of stigma about getting high on your own supply. I have a few ways that I find my books. Obviously, the internet is an option, but it's usually pretty hard to get good deals on rare books online these days. There's so much competition, and there's always one buyer who decides he needs the book no matter the cost. Occasionally, you can find good specimens at estate sales, but by far my favorite and most fruitful method is traveling to old bookstores in old cities. Those little hole-in-the-wall places with books stacked everywhere, and walking through it, you feel like no mortal man knows what all's stacked within its walls. And yet, somehow, the elderly shopkeep seems to remember every book he's ever bought and sold, and can locate any book in his domain at the slightest hint that you may be interested in viewing it. It was in a store such as that I found the last book I would ever add to my collection. I was walking around the streets of an old Italian town. I suppose that now that the book is in my possession, there's no danger in visiting that store, but something feels like the place is better left alone. I was walking around on the last day of my very fruitful tour of several shops, some I had visited before and some I had heard about from fellow collectors. I wouldn't have known that this store was there except that just as I was passing by, a distraught-looking young man in a gray suit hurried out of the shop, leaving the door open in his haste. Through the open door, before the proprietor closed it, I caught a glimpse of the stacks of old books and an ancient-looking cash register, one of those ones with a big lever to pull to power its computations. This store piqued my interest. This sort of non-obvious hole in the wall was exactly what I was looking for. I nervously approached the entrance. Even after years of seeking these places out, I've never been able to shake the feeling of not being welcome in these hidden little sanctuaries. Like a bumbling explorer trampling through some sacred site with loud, heavy feet. I opened up the old, unmarked door, waiting to see if my entrance would be rebuffed. My fears were, those fears were unfounded. The old man inside, behind the counter, stared me down, watching my timid entrance without interference. Like he knew this was a providential event, and he dare not intervene. I greeted him, explaining I was a collector of rare books. He gave me a knowing nod, telling me to speak up if I need any help. I got to it, plying my craft as I explored the stack of books, searching for hidden prizes. There were a few mildly interesting finds, but nothing I couldn't have found half a dozen places elsewhere. After a couple hours of sunk cost fueled searching, I decided to call it a day and head back to my hotel to get some rest before my early flight in the morning. As I took my meager findings up to the register, I tried to make small talk with the man, but he didn't seem to have much interest. He let the conversation fall to awkward silence as he looked over my finds. While I was looking around, trying not to make awkward eye contact in the silence, I took note of an old, odd-looking book in a bin behind the counter. It was an unmarked, hand-bound book with a worn leather cover. I asked if I could take a look at it. Glancing down at it, and then at the door as if recalling something. He nodded in approval. I expected him to hand it to me, but instead he stepped out from behind the counter and gestured for me to retrieve it myself. I did so, feeling a pang of excitement. I was surprised at how hefty the book was and carried it back to the customer side of the counter and opened it to see if I could get a sense of its worth. The first thing I found in the book was an illustration of a kind of sad-looking old man sitting alone in a library with empty shelves behind him, reading the singular book in the scene. He had this resigned look on his face, like a man performing some sort of onerous penance. I flipped forward looking for a title page, and I found one. It was in Arabic, a language I don't speak. Still, the book was clearly old and clearly unique, so I thought it was worth buying for personal curiosity at least and potential profit at best. I asked the old man how much he'd want for it, and he took a moment of calculation and told me it was free. He told me a distraught young man had just left it in there, and he said it felt unlucky. I tried to reverse haggle to get the price up, but he would not consider taking my money. Eventually, he became agitated and firmly told me to get out of the shop and not to come back. That was the first time I've been kicked out of a shop for trying to overpay. I tried to pay for my other books, but the man just wanted me gone at that point so bad that he shoved them into my hands and started shouting at me to leave. Insulted and a little embarrassed, I heeded his commands and left, hearing the door lock behind me as I walked down the steps. I returned to my hotel where I found a number of police and paramedics outside, gathered within a police line around the gruesome remains of a young man in a gray suit who had apparently jumped from one of the upper balconies. When I got up to my room, I tried to get some rest, but the reaction of the old man and the sight from below had set my nerves going again. I found myself idly flipping through that old book, staring at the indecipherable flowing script, wondering what exactly it was that I had found. I ended up almost missing my flight the next morning, since I stayed up most of the night staring at that book. The long transatlantic flight went by pretty fast. Spent most of the flight looking at the book. At one point I tried to put it away and take out a different book, but somehow I absent-mindedly pulled it out again. When I arrived home, I called a friend of mine, a language professor at the local university who knows Arabic. I invited him over to see if we could discover what exactly this book was that I had bought or been given. The next morning, he joined me for coffee, a little bribe for his services. And after some idle chat about my trip and his kids, he took a look at my book. Looking it over, he gave me a puzzled look as he asked me if I was sure that I hadn't meant to ask him about Greek. I reassured him that I know the difference between Greek and Arabic, but when he turned the book around and held it up for me to see for myself, sure enough, what once had been Arabic that I had spent hours staring at was now clearly Greek of some sort. Unfortunately, neither of us spoke Greek. He gave me the number of a Greek professor he knew, and we finished our little coffee and chat. I tried my best to be an entertaining host, but I was preoccupied thinking about the book. After my colleague left, I decided to put that odd book out of my mind and review the other books I had acquired on my trip. I unpacked the various tomes I had procured on my journey and sat down at my computer to log them into my database. Picked up the first book in my stack, opening it to log the details, only to be surprised to see the illustration of an old man sitting holding the singular book staring back at me. I thought I must have added the mystery book to my stack by mistake, and so I set it aside and picked up the next book. Only when I did, found that I was holding the same book I thought I had just set down. I looked over to where I set it on the table next to me and saw a poetry book, a collection of Goethe. Confused, I once again put down the book and picked up the poetry book. And again, for the third time, I attempted to open a different book than the one that had been plaguing me, only to find once again, that same distraught man sitting behind the empty bookshelves. I set the book down and went and opened the windows and sat outside for some fresh air. Something was really off with the whole situation. I was worried that maybe I had carbon monoxide poisoning or something. It was probably a bad decision in that confused state, but I decided to take a drive to clear my head and get some fresh air. That book was like a parasitic worm, though, just stuck in my mind. Ended up at a local library to reassure myself that it was just an absent-minded accident. I didn't bring anything with me, so I could be sure there was no way for me to accidentally pick up the same book again. I walked into the stacks and grabbed a book at random. I held my breath as I opened it, only to find the same lonely illustration, followed by page after page of what looked like Russian. Not that I know Russian, but it was certainly some sort of Cyrillic script. I dropped it where I stood. My fingers were going numb from shock or fear. In some sort of fugue state, I walked over to some young guy, probably college-aged, and without saying a word, took one of his textbooks he had on the table next to him. Before he had a chance to stop me, I opened it to see that desolate man in some sort of Asian script and felt the worn leather covering in my hands. Naturally, the owner of the textbook wasn't too pleased to see me pick up one of his textbooks only for it to be nowhere to be seen by the time he looked up. He had some heated words for me that were soothed by a few $100. A small price to pay, I suppose, to discover that it wasn't just in my head. The book wasn't just stuck in my thoughts, it was stuck in my hands as well. I returned home dejected. I had hoped, as crazy as it may sound, that I was losing my mind, but this was something much worse. Tried to pick up just about every book in my library, but every time the same result. Somehow, without my noticing, whichever book I tried to read, I would find that cursed book in my hand staring up at me. The only difference was which language, always one I didn't know, was scribbled within. Tried to take my mind off my peculiar curse, but I couldn't get that book out of my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that damned illustration or pages of unreadable, at least by me, text. When I eventually slept that night, I even dreamed of the blasted thing. In the following days, I found myself spending hours staring at the book, flipping through the pages, despite my lack of comprehension. As time went on, I began to experience moments of understanding, for lack of a better word. Maybe it was madness, but I would have moments of intuition, I suppose, where I sensed some meaning in the text, phrases here and there, despite the text always remaining a language I didn't know. As I began grasping more of the text, I began to decipher that the book was not a pleasant read. I would catch bits describing violent or disturbing things, grotesque descriptions of demented ideas. After a time, I found I could understand enough to comprehend sort of general narratives. The text seemed far too relevant to me personally for my comfort. It contained stories of men very similar to myself, suffering horrible fates and committing terrible acts. What's more, and out of shame and fear I will not describe them, the book gave accounts of men doing things that I had done, shameful things that I hide from the world, dark thoughts and terrible actions that I wouldn't even whisper aloud when I was alone to myself, just out of the shame. It was as if the book itself was accusing me. It recorded terrible things that I had myself done, terrible intrusive thoughts that I would try to put out of my mind. And seeing as how it so thoroughly condemned my past sins, my greatest and most shameful thoughts and actions, I began to fear that the other horrid accounts, things I had not yet done, thoughts I had not thought, perhaps also were accusations. I, of course, tried to destroy the book of my sins, but I couldn't rid myself of it. I tossed it in a river. I buried it, even tried to burn it. As I'm sure you could have predicted, it always seemed to find its way back to me. I tried to just stop reading it to at least stop feeding my horror by continuously having my deepest flaws reflected back at me. The thoughts of the book filled my mind in all my waking hours and in all my dreams. I could no more rid this book from my mind than I could rid it from my possession. Soon I did little else other than stare at the book, staring at that unreadable text that made perfect sense to me. I have not looked in a mirror in quite some time, but I feel my expression must have come to resemble that of the old man of the illustration, or that young man I saw leaving that faded bookstore, and later saw dead on the street. I wonder what horrible things the book told him. What facets of his heart did it reflect back to him? The book so accurately describes my past and my heart. I feel like it must be describing my future as well. At the very least, its accusations sound plausible. Maybe the only way to be sure that I don't go down the path it seems to predict is to take a decisive action that renders me unable to commit any more terrible acts.